Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 5, Gilgamesh and the Deluge. Today is a special episode, which is almost entirely focused on the lore of the most famous piece of Bronze Age literature and one of the era's most influential collections of mythology and folklore, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This week, I've got a little bit from special guest scholar Susan Ackerman here to talk about Gilgamesh, homoeroticism, and the kinds of things that are allowed to exist in liminal spaces. Susan is the retired Preston H. Kelsey Professor of Religion, Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. Her work often focuses on women's roles in cult in ancient West Asia, and she's incredible at teasing out details in the texts that otherwise might escape our notice.
But here's a woman commissioning a religious image, which then I think the most logical reading of the text ends up in what is called the household shrine of her son Micah in verse 5. That is, she's not just commissioning this image, she is providing furnishings, a furnishing for the household shrine. And given what we know archaeologically about the scarcity of metals in ancient Israel and their preciousness, a cast metal image of the god Yahweh has got to be the most precious image that's in that shrine. There are others. The text goes on to talk about other stuff that's in the shrine, but she's got to put the best thing in the shrine. She's the patron of the shrine. And I take that as a pretty extraordinary story about, again, did that story really happen? I can't tell you, but I can tell you the biblical authors imagined it to be possible because it must have rung true with what was possible in the world in which they lived.
And she's not condemned for that in the text.
Oh.
It is not proscribed.
No, not at all.
I recorded the interview with Susan back in September, and in the meantime, I significantly rewrote the entire outline for the show, so there's only a little bit that ended up being relevant to Gilgamesh, but I've added an extended clip at the end as well where we talk about her upcoming book, and of course the full interview will go up in a couple of days on the feed at patreon.com/Bible Lore Podcast. No just Bible Lore Podcast. Anyway. Today's main sources are Andrew George's translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, both the prose and the poetic versions, Dr. Ackerman's own When Heroes Love, and Irving Finkel's The Ark Before Noah. As always, these and all other sources will be listed in the bibliography portion of the description of this episode. Last time, we brought the Bronze Age to a catastrophic end in the closing centuries of the second millennium BCE. This wasn't the first time such a collapse had occurred, nor would it be the last, but it was the most brutal and total catastrophe thus far. Some 1600 years prior, in the early third millennium, somewhere between 2900 and 2400, there likely was a king in Sumer called Gilgamesh. We know next to nothing about him. Near the end of this millennium, around the year 2100, when we started this whole podcast, embellished stories about him were told, stories which survived the Bronze Age intermediary period that kicked off the Late Bronze Age, their own smaller collapse. This folklore version of the probably real Gilgamesh developed him as a character, a hero king with divine roots whose legend would grow even further over the second millennium and come to include tales where he battled supernatural monsters, met gods and legendary figures like one who'd survived a global flood, had the plant that was the key to immortality stolen from him by a snake, and learned important lessons about friendship and death along the way. Throughout the 1,000-year history we've covered so far, stories about Gilgamesh were being told in the background of most of these societies, except for maybe Egypt. I haven't seen any evidence that he made it that far. The stories contained in the epic bear striking similarities to several biblical tales, and the epic itself would be directly quoted by at least one biblical author. Maybe it makes me basic, but the Epic of Gilgamesh is my favorite work from this period. While it has themes and morals, it's mostly allowed to be just a story, unlike most of the texts we've covered so far. Enuma Elish, the Ball Cycle, the Great Hymn to Aten, they were all to some extent liturgical texts, probably designed to be recited at cultic ceremonies and festivals. That's all important, and I do enjoy studying stuff like that, but Gilgamesh has less liturgy and far more pure literary quality. Additionally, the way the compilers weave together these disparate short stories to form a cohesive narrative is pretty amazing. And it's still got a sort of sly sense of humor and irony at parts, which makes it relatable and understandable even today. The saga's ruminations on the fear of death are so universally human, and it has the kind of downer ending that I like. So much of a downer ending, in fact, that someone apparently decided to rework it to be more satisfying. The epic is also kinda gay. More on that in a bit. Some of the earliest tales of what would become the Epic of Gilgamesh were probably first written down just before the dawn of the Late Bronze Age, and the flood narrative seems to have come from around the same time, a few centuries before Hammurabi came on the scene. How far back the oral traditions go is completely unknown, but during Hammurabi's lifetime, we get our first serious global flood story in the form of a small, typical-sized cuneiform tablet about the size of something like a Pop-Tart or a mid-2010s smartphone. The Ark Before Noah is one of my favorite books. I know. I tell you at least once per episode to buy a book, and I make no apologies. The scholar and author Irving Finkel is incredibly skilled at making you excited to learn about a bunch of clay hot pockets they dug out of the dirt, which is no small feat. In the book, Finkel notes something fascinating about this early version of the flood story. The ark is round. It seems to be a giant version of what the Welsh call a coracle and what Iraqis called a kufar, a type of round boat that looks kind of like a wider version of the guy's pot in the video game Getting Over It, or a South African boiki, a cooking vessel, though they can often have flat bottoms as well. These circular coracles of various sizes, waterproofed in naturally occurring bitumen, were in use on the Tigris and Euphrates in Iraq from at least 4000 BCE until somewhere around or after the Second World War, probably the realm of 6,000 years or more total usage. Similar boats are still used today from Wales to Vietnam to Tibet. Other Gilgamesh stories that would work their way into the epic were written over the first half of the second millennium, and some even failed to make the cut. You've got to feel pretty miffed as a shade in the underworld when you find out centuries later that your Gilgamesh story wasn't chosen for inclusion in the epic tale. Over the second half of the millennium, the stories deemed fitting were weaved together into a longer tale, and the flood story is incorporated as a key flashback in Gilgamesh's quest for immortality, though not one starring the man himself. Copies of Gilgamesh stories and the epic, usually fragments, have been found in Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. The guy was very popular. We're still missing some portions of it, but the reality is we may find the rest of it. We may one day have the complete Epic of Gilgamesh, which is very exciting. Somewhere around the Late Bronze Age collapse we covered last episode, one version of the epic seems to have become relatively stable, and it was passed down over the centuries in some manner. The thing is, some cities survived that brutal time period, and they kept and copied the texts that they had. The Bronze Age collapse represents a period of what scholars call liminality. Now, the word liminal has turned into a mostly stupid internet meme, but it's critical to understanding so many periods, especially periods of chaos. Liminal at its core means something in between, a period or location of transition from one time or place to another, even both time and place. There's usually no hard cut from one era to the next, and even in the case of a catastrophe like the Bronze Age collapse, a transitional period followed that allowed for much more significant change. As an example, few people had the foresight to say, wow, I'm living in the dang internet era in 1999, and yet within a year of 99's end, a serious economic setback would come in part because of the internet. That's a modern liminality that is still ruining our lives today, as we are firmly and decidedly in the internet era proper. But through these transitional periods, while some potentially new and exciting things crumble into dust, like early grocery delivery efforts or Pets.com, others like Amazon survived and even thrived. So too with the Bronze Age and the Iron Age that we are getting into. Gilgamesh was more like the latter than the former, and the epic seems to have been popular enough during this period to still flourish after a cataclysmic downturn. A copy of this version made its way into the hands of King Ashurbanipal, the bookish grandson of the Neo-Assyrian king who had destroyed the kingdom of Israel around 700 BCE. This version mostly tracks with previous editions found at the end of the Bronze Age, but with the gap of several centuries from, 1200 to 700, the fact that a lot of this is pieced together from a variety of fragments and the way the poetry has been converted into prose, it's hard to know how much the Neo-Assyrian scribes reshaped the text. Probably not a lot, but it's important to keep that in mind. Ashurbanipal was a brutal and violent king, like many of the so-called great kings of the late Neo-Assyrian Empire, but he was also a huge literature dork, and he sent out merchants to collect and copy stories from around the region that he ruled and wherever he could get his hands on a tablet. Without him being a gigantic book nerd, we would have far less of the epic to work with. Ditto his brutal expansionism, because the backlash to his wrathful, genocidal rule would result in the destruction of the Neo-Assyrian Empire a short while after his death. When the Neo-Babylonians destroyed his capital at Nineveh some decades later, around 600 BCE, his extensive library was, say it with me, buried in the dirt for archaeologists to rediscover millennia later. I swear not every episode of this show will feature a city abandoned and a library of texts buried with it, just this first handful. Probably. Alright, so that's the majority of the historical context you'll need. Let's get to the story. Like other texts from this era, the versions of the epic are named after their opening words. The Old Babylonian version was called Surpassing All Other Kings, but today we'll mostly be using the later standard version titled He Who Saw the Deep. I'll skip over the intro where the narrator praises Gilgamesh for everything he's about to do in the story. We don't need more spoilers. Once upon a time in the city of Uruk, about halfway between modern Basra and Baghdad in Iraq, there was a king called Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh, a king at Uruk.
Gilgamesh was not a good king. He took the right of prima nocta with all of the beautiful brides in the city, and boy did it make the townsfolk hate him.
But I have not yet kissed the bride. It is a custom and my royal right. Hold this, father.
Rabbi.
Whatever.
It's good to be the king.
Did I mention he was a demigod? Indeed he was. His father was a human, and his mother, Ninsun, was a goddess. Shamash, the god of the sun, made him beautiful, and Adad, a storm god closely related to Baal and Yahweh, gave him courage. His behavior was kind of like Thor at the beginning of the first movie, if I'm remembering that movie right, where he basically did as he pleased, secure in the knowledge that he was above everyone around him. The gods who were responsible for making Gilgamesh too powerful and horny heard the pleas of his subjects, and what did the gods do? Did they make a female companion for Gilgamesh like God does for Adam in Genesis after discovering that none of the animals would make a good partner? No. Anu, the sky god, pleaded with Aruru, the goddess of creation. You, Aruru, created mankind. Now fashion what Anu has thought of. Let him be a match for the storm of his heart. Let them vie with each other so Uruk may be rested. That's right, she did him one better than a wife. She made him a homie. Aruru made Enkidu from the clay, much like Adam in Genesis 2 is made from the soil. Enkidu was a hairy and wild man who ate grass and ran with the gazelles. His natural state is similar to the idealized picture of the pre-flood society in Genesis, where he existed in a sort of harmony with nature, somewhere between the primordial chaos and civilization. One day, a young trapper came across Enkidu, destroying his traps and helping his animal friends escape. In panic at seeing this guy who looked like Bigfoot but with matted hair, perhaps in soulful white boy dreadlocks, the trapper told his father of this swole Yeti Chad who was ruining his chance to get prey. The father knew just what to do. He sent his trapper son off to Uruk to ask Gilgamesh, the king, for a sex worker from the temple district, telling Gilgamesh of this wild man whose strength matched his own. Gilgamesh obliged, noting that when Enkidu saw the naked woman, he would undoubtedly be entranced and impelled to give up his rough and rowdy ways. The prostitute, who's sometimes named Shamhat, meaning something like the lusty or well-endowed one, was unaware of the plot she was being dragged into, but she did as she was told, and after a few days of waiting at the watering hole, Enkidu and the animals cautiously returned. Enkidu was indeed enraptured by Shamhat and what the text calls the woman's art, and they banged for 6 days and 7 nights. As Gilgamesh predicted, however, when the other animals smelled the scent of sex on Enkidu, they avoided him, much like when your own friend gets a new romantic partner with a Funko Pop collection who's just a little too into Anchorman and won't stop quoting it every time they're around. That stink don't wash off. Enkidu also lost some of his strength and swiftness and could no longer run with the gazelles. The wild man returned to the woman, and she explained that he'd become wise like the gods, much like Adam and Eve when they eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She told him of Gilgamesh, the king as strong as a bull who used his strength to oppress and annoy his own people. Intrigued, Enkidu vowed to challenge this haughty king, and they set off. While they were en route to Uruk, Gilgamesh had a dream of a star, a meteor that fell from heaven that even he would not be able to lift. And yet he felt destined to love this great burden, attracted to it like a woman. And when he was able to bring it to his mother, the goddess Ninsun, she declared the boulder his brother. He had a similar dream about an axe that he would keep at his side. This, too, was Enkidu. Enkidu, meanwhile, ate bread and drank wine and washed his hair, finally becoming fully human. As they were traveling and Enkidu became a protector of his new herdsman friends, a traveler approached and told them in exasperation that Gilgamesh had declared his intent to once again invoke his right to have sex with someone's fiancée on their wedding night, and again the people were incensed by this. Enkidu, civilized enough to realize just how wrong this was, rushed to Uruk and waited until night. And when Gilgamesh came to the house, Enkidu sprang upon him and the main event began. They beat each other and wrestled and crashed into houses and doorways, shattering everything around them in the crowded city streets. Finally, Gilgamesh was able to pick up Enkidu and throw him, unleashing his signature Michinoku driver. Enkidu picked himself up, dusted himself off, looked Gilgamesh in the eye, and praised him as the strongest guy that ever was. They embraced like Schwarzenegger and Carl Weathers in Predator. I'm not kidding, this shit is literally out of a Fast and Furious movie. In this case, this story was part of a sort of etiology for just why Babylonian boys would wrestle with each other as part of their annual Festival of Lights. Like anyone who's met their new platonic best friend, Gilgamesh immediately brought Enkidu before his mother, the goddess Ninsun. At some point during their meeting, though, Enkidu became depressed from being a swole neat with no purpose in life. And this sadness made Gilgamesh realize that he himself hadn't really done anything with his life worth being written down on a tablet. Suddenly, Gilgamesh had an idea to solve his own ennui and his friend's aimlessness. Let's go kill the god monster protecting the magical forest of cedars, where some say the gods themselves lived. Yes, we're heading back to the Forest of Cedars, the same location Bata fled to in the Egyptian tale of two brothers, and the very same where the prophet Isaiah would one day look for help. Before they could get too carried away, though, Enkidu relayed his concerns about this adventure to the Forest of Cedars and the prospect of defeating the horrible monster Humbaba, also known as Huwawa. See, he'd met Humbaba before. I knew him, my friend, in the uplands, when I roamed here and there with the herd. For 60 leagues the forest is a wilderness. Who is there would venture inside it? Humbaba, his voice is the deluge. His speech is fire and his breath is death. Why do you desire to do this thing? An unwinnable battle is Humbaba's ambush. Enkidu cautioned that even the underworld gods, the Anunnaki, also known as the Ijiji, wouldn't dare fight Humbaba. See, Humbaba was not merely a guardian god of the forest. He was also some kind of giant chimera, a liminal beast that existed between the purely divine and the purely animal or human. His iconography may have been the basis for Medusa, as in art of the time his face is covered in what seemed to be human entrails, an even more horrifying countenance than the Gorgon's snake-plastered visage. Even without eyes that could turn a man to stone, encountering the divine was considered dangerous and even lethal, even with divinity that was good or on your side, and so measures were taken by humans to protect themselves from being killed or becoming cursed by interacting with the divine improperly, And this is reflected in both standard kinds of proper ritual, like crossing yourself or taking your shoes off before entering a mosque, and we see this reflected in works like Gilgamesh and the Bible. This is visible also in the way temple care was delicately and specifically prescribed. The gods lived in the temple, so you'd better be wearing the right stuff and saying the right words and providing the right sacrifices in the right order to protect yourself from encountering divinity the wrong way. If something bad happened after you screwed something up in handling the temple rites improperly, natural human intuition draws a connection between the two events. You accidentally tipped over the altar, and then next week or next month your cousin comes down with an illness. Your mind might connect the two events. Call it superstition, but almost everyone does it. I've referenced Francesca Stavrakopoulou's wonderful book, God and Anatomy, a few times on this show, and deservingly so. It's great. I'm going to reference it again. The original British cover features an artistic depiction of footprints based on the Temple of Ain Dara in northern Syria. At the temple, the footprints were carved into the entryway, and they were about 1 meter long. That's 1 yard for you Americans. These huge footprints were only shown going into the temple. The god went in, but never came out. It's possible that it had a stele or a massivot rather than a statue as its locus of worship, and it was the closest temple we found to the description of the Judahite temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple. I use the past tense here because, unfortunately, the Ain Dara temple site was fired upon and struck by Turkish Air Force missiles in early 2018 as part of the recently concluded Syrian civil war. Thank you, as always, to the watermelon seller Erdogan. These temples were both the houses for the gods, ones where they, to some extent, were literally thought to live, but also not really. For the gods existed outside of the mortal realm, in a place that was lethal to humans. It's this sort of liminality, this in-between, that helps resolve some of the paradoxes. It relieves some of the tension, at least, in human engagement with the supernatural. Because the supernatural is invisible if you're a believer or a practitioner, this idea of liminality helps to explain and visualize how these tensions can exist. So the statue or stele or altar or cross or focus on Mecca is both a helpful locus, a visual and cognitive aid to direct one's praise or offerings to the god in question, while not necessarily being the literal god. It exists in a state somewhere in between. That's liminality in the academic sense. And this is probably why chimeras, cherubim, griffins, centaurs, and all sorts of other mixed beasts, what's called Mischwesen in German, end up being so common in human conceptions of divinity. They can be scary, sure, and instill a fear of the gods, like the prophet Ezekiel's description of otherworldly snakes with wings covering their mouths and genitals at the beginning of his book. But they're drawn from creatures and elements that are common to all of us. Regular-ass animals on the one hand, remixed into being strange and foreign and impossible on the other. It gives it a sense of divinity, of otherworldliness. So it is with Humbaba and his entrail face. But Gilgamesh did not share Enkidu's skepticism of defeating Humbaba. He reprimanded Enkidu for being soy and beta, saying, "Why, my friend, do you speak like a coward? With your feeble talk you vex my heart. As for man, his days are numbered. Whatever he may do, it is but the wind." This passage is paraphrased, quoted in Ecclesiastes, the best book of the Bible by a country mile, and we'll talk about it more in a bit. Gilgamesh reassured his new pal that this fight against Humbaba wouldn't be a problem, and that seems to have quelled Enkidu's doubts. Gilgamesh and Enkidu thus vowed to kill Humbaba, and while doing so, Gilgamesh promised upon his return to celebrate the new year twice a year to mark his triumph. This is what's called an etiology. An etiology is basically a folk explanation or tale to justify or explain something that already exists in the culture. These could be explanations for words, what's called a folk etymology, or they could be explanations for holidays like the Festival of Lights wrestling matches I mentioned earlier. Whatever the reason the Babylonians celebrated 2 New Year's festivals was lost to time, and so a satisfactory legend was composed, or in this case, incorporated into a legendary tale to explain it. Maybe some king really did want a second New Year after he returned from a military campaign or a hunting trip or something, but they're not always based on real circumstances. A modern example would be the etiology which asserts that the kipferl, the Austrian predecessor to the croissant, was shaped as a crescent to mock the defeated Ottomans, who had crescent moons upon their banners during the 17th century siege of Vienna. This, of course, is untrue, as kipferl had been shaped that way for many years predating the Habsburg-Ottoman Wars entirely. But we still love stories like this that bring more meaning to the past, even if they're not historical, and Gilgamesh has a few of them. The Bible, too, contains many ideologies, especially the Torah. Why was Israel called Israel, which means El strives or strives with El? Because the ancestor Jacob literally wrestled with the God himself. Why is that big pillar of salt that looks kind of like a woman over there? Because Lot's wife couldn't keep her eyes on the ball. The wrestling matches and the double New Year's are just the first two of quite a few ideologies in the epic. So Gilgamesh and Enkidu, two New Year's vows in hand, collected wisdom and advice on how to kill Humbaba from wherever they could find it, from many of the gods. And Gilgamesh's mom, Ninsun the wild cow goddess, formally adopted Enkidu as her own son, making the pair adult adopted brothers, an even more advanced and powerful version of informal cousins. Ninsun also appealed to the gods and requested a blessing from the sun god Shamash on her boy's behalf. Gilgamesh gives his out-of-office instructions to the city's administrator so that Uruk doesn't fall apart in his absence. They get a formal send-off from the cheering crowds, and they head off on their adventure. Just the two of them. The lads made their trek to the mountains, and on the third night they did a little dream ritual, and Gilgamesh put his chin on his knees and fell asleep. Awakening from a nightmare instead, he described his terrible vision to Enkidu. The dream that I had was in utter confusion. We were standing on a mountain slope. The mountain fell down between us, but we like flies flew clean over it. Enkidu reassured him that this was a good omen of them defeating Humbaba with Shamash's help, with Humbaba as the mountain who was to fall beneath them. 4 times more, every third day, a similar ritual and nightmare is described, many times with Shamash, the sun god, coming to their rescue. A few weeks in, they finally arrived at the entrance to the Mountain of Cedars, marveling at its glory from a distance. But a dread overcame Gilgamesh, and his faith in himself began to falter. Enkidu reassured him, telling him that he's not alone, that 2 are stronger than 1, and that a 3-ply cord is not easily broken. This section is both paraphrased and quoted directly in Ecclesiastes, also known as Kohelet for our Jewish listeners. Here's chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, from Robert Alter's translation. If 2 lie together, they are warm, but as for one, how will he be warm? And if one should attack him, the 2 will stand against him, and the triple cord will not quickly be snapped. Now, I love Robert Alter's translation, but there's something a bit odd in his commentary for these verses. He says, quote, "It is not necessary to conclude that either marriage or sex is implied, especially since what has been envisaged to this point is the advantage gained through a man's having a companion. The warmth of a shared bed could easily be that of 2 companions, without sexual intent." And then there's a parenthetical, like Ishmael and Queequeg at the beginning of Moby Dick. And this set off some red flags for me. Moby Dick is one of my favorite books of all time, and I think we might be dealing with some cultural bias that needlessly excludes homoeroticism. In recent works on Herman Melville's life and writing, scholars have noted his experiences seeing openly practiced homosexuality on whaling vessels and in French Polynesia. And contrary to Alter, I think Moby Dick itself displays a sort of ambiguity and perhaps cheekiness about just how physical Ishmael and Queequeg's relationship is. They're basically shown getting married. To me, it actually provides a great analog not only to Gilgamesh and Enkidu, but also to King David and his good buddy Jonathan. And obviously this is what Dr. Ackerman's book, When Heroes Love, is about. So I asked her about her perspective on these relationships, how they're portrayed, how affection, attraction, and erotic attachment between same-sex pairs was understood in deep antiquity.
The book you're referring to, its main title is When Heroes Love. And so Gilgamesh and Enkidu are 2 of my heroes. David and Jonathan are my other 2 heroes. But the subtitle is the ambiguity of Eros in the stories of Gilgamesh and David. And I stress the ambiguity because what interested me the most, what still interests me the most, is how ambiguous the language is. And it's not surprising that interpreters in both those cases, the Gilgamesh and Enkidu story and the David and Jonathan story, have read in both directions. Some read, like you say, like Robert Alter, there is no homoerotic imagery. Others read exactly the opposite. And that's because the language is so ambiguous. One of the ways it's ambiguous has to do a little bit with our cultural distance. So, for example, kissing in the ancient world doesn't necessarily carry the erotic connotations we might think of kissing carrying in our world. Kissing is an act of homage. Kissing is an act of submission. Kissing is an act of loyalty. And so kissing between same-sex partners doesn't necessarily carry eroticism. So there's one way ambiguity happens, but another way ambiguity happens is the texts themselves are quite oblique in terms of the homoerotic language and imagery they use. My own sense is that they're deliberately oblique. My own sense is for Gilgamesh and Enkidu that what that text is trying to do is, again, work within the context of one of my favorite words, liminal. It's trying to work within a context of liminal time and liminal space, where Gilgamesh and Enkidu really do kind of become separate from their cultural context. They go on these great adventures together, and that outside of that culture and societal context, it's not just that you've broken through the boundaries of your I don't know, city in Gilgamesh's case, or country or whatever. It's not just that you've broken through those boundaries, but all kinds of other boundaries in terms of normative sexual relations, let's say, kind of begin to erode as well. So in Moby Dick, we talk about relationships that happen when men are out at sea or when men are away from their families, right? They've broken out of the societally normative worlds that define particular roles and particular ways of being in society. And once you've broken out of that, once you've entered into, again, to use my favorite word, into that kind of liminal time and place, all kinds of other things happen as well. And I think that's one of the things that's going on in Gilgamesh. My favorite chapter in my book about Gilgamesh is called The Liminal Hero. And it's called that precisely because I think once Gilgamesh kind of takes on this more liminal way of living in the world, then again, the intimations about same-sex eroticism become a way of helping signal that liminality.
And so this is one of the keys to understanding a lot of the Bible. In my interview with Kerry Sonia, she mentioned something important. We rarely get prescriptive texts in the Bible. More often, folks in these stories are responding to when something goes wrong, or living in transitional periods where there's no official cult, there's no official state. On the one hand, we can often infer what the correct procedure or expectation was supposed to be, but on the other, because we're in sort of a liminal space where something is going wrong, the rules are often bent, exceptions are made, and what's normally illicit can often get a pass. So Gilgamesh was afraid. Enkidu, Gilgamesh's roommate, then reminded his friend of the blessing he'd secured from the sun god Shamash. Gilgamesh called on the sun, who shouted from above that they must not allow Humbaba to wrap himself in his 7 magical cloaks. They pocketed this helpful NPC tip and readied themselves for battle. When Humbaba saw these 2 himbos approaching, he began revealing his even bigger battle form and taunting them, reminding them that he could have killed either of them from the day they were born if he'd wished. Gilgamesh once again began to falter, with tears flowing down his face. And in a delightful reversal, Enkidu reassured him using the same words Gilgamesh had spoken to him earlier. "Why, my friend, do you speak like a coward? With your feeble talk, you vex my heart." Suddenly they rushed head-on at Humbaba, with Gilgamesh striking the ground 9 times and shattering the mountain beneath their feet. They sprung on Humbaba and held him down in the confusion, grabbing his deadly auras as best they could to keep him from using them. Humbaba bounced back and launched the 3 of them high into the air, before slamming them all back down, but the ground held and they were unmoved. Before Humbaba could strike again, Shamash made good on his promised help, and like Marduk and Enuma Elish, he called on the winds. South, north, east, and west, blast, counterblast, typhoon, hurricane, and tempest, devil wind, frost wind, gale, and tornado, 13 wind spells in all. Some would say he was a bit overleveled for the fight, and the devs should probably debuff his spells for balance sake. Humbaba was pinned and began to beg for his life, promising even to be Gilgamesh's slave. In a pitiable twist, the author even uses the same words to describe Humbaba's tears as Gilgamesh's tears when he feared for his life before the battle began. But Enkidu warned Gilgamesh that if the gods found out about this, they'd be in huge trouble. On the other hand, if they killed Humbaba, they would earn the fear and respect of all men and gods. As Enkidu refused to hear Humbaba's repeated cries for mercy, and Gilgamesh contemplated what to do, the forest monster, sensing his death, began uttering curses that Enkidu and Gilgamesh would not grow old. Before he could speak out any more fateful words, Gilgamesh stabbed him in the neck. Enkidu cut out his heart, and a river of blood and gore gushed out onto the forest floor. They cut off Humbaba's head and took parts of his corpse as trophies, and in their bloodlust they started tearing down the trees and desecrating the forest. This depiction of brutal, pitiless slaughter of a forest creature would many years later go on to inspire the climactic scene in the Studio Ghibli film Princess Mononoke, in which Lady Eboshi decapitates the forest spirit and its blood flows into the forest and kills all it touches. That's a little bonus lore for today. Like the builders of Solomon's temple, Gilgamesh and Enkidu wanted the best Lebanese timber available, and after cutting indiscriminately through cedar after cedar, they finally found the tallest and most majestic one. Felling it with their magical axes, they made a raft and sent their lumber down the river, including a giant door for the Uruk temple. Temple doors and city gates had social and cultic value. Kings and elders of the city were expected to sit at the gate and judge disputes and provide justice for the poor, the widow, and the orphan, the marginalized and destitute, in other words. In one particularly fun folk legend in the book of Judges, the hero Samson, on the run from the Philistines but also deep in Philistine territory, ends up at the city of Gaza, where he purchases the services of a sex worker. A group of Philistine men plot to ambush him at morning's light, similar to Enkidu waiting in ambush until evening for Gilgamesh when they're first introduced. Instead, Samson subverts this by leaving at midnight and stealing the city's massive gate, carrying it into the highlands by himself. Paul Davidson over at the wonderful Inquisitive Bible Reader YouTube channel has a really great recent video going over this passage. I'll link it in the show description. And so, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, door and timber in hand, returned to Uruk victorious. They showered off, and Gilgamesh put his crown back on, and his beautiful figure attracted the attention of one Ishtar, the Queen of Heaven. The Queen of Heaven gets a few mentions in the Bible, and it probably refers to Asherah, though it could refer to Ishtar, Astarte, or Anat. The problem is that the differentiation between these gods was one of human perception. Is Yahweh the same as El? Is Yahweh the same as Baal? Is Yahweh the unnamed idol, as Paul is made to argue in the book of Acts? Yes, no, maybe so, depends on who you ask. Regardless of whether this Ishtar is the same goddess as the one condemned in the Bible as the Queen of Heaven, in this case she was down bad for Gilgamesh. But Gilgamesh already had a love in his life. And besides, even if he wasn't already coupled with the handsome wild men Enkidu, he justifiably responded with concerns of the unfortunate ends that Ishtar's previous lovers had met. One she turned into a wolf, and one into a dwarf. Flying into a rage at this rejection by some mere half-god, Ishtar returned to her father, the sky god Anu, who is roughly cognate with Amun, Saturn, maybe Cronus, and definitely El. In fact, just like in last episode's story of Akkad, who rejected Anat's offer to buy his weapons and went to her father, El, in a rage to get permission to kill Akkad, Ishtar went to Anu and asked permission to sick the bull of heaven on this presumptuous and haughty king. See, it's not just the Bible where motifs get borrowed and repeated. This was the practice of the time, and it's frankly something we still do today. As Cormac McCarthy once put it, books are made of other books. Anu gave in after Ishtar threatened to break down the very gates of the underworld and let the shades out to consume the earth. So the bull was brought to the earth. In depictions of the early Iron Age, the bull of heaven is portrayed sometimes as just a huge bull, but also sometimes instead as something like an Israelite cherubim or an Assyrian lamassu, a bull or lion with massive wings and a human head. Regardless of whether the Ark of the Covenant existed or not, it is these styles of cherubim that spread their wings on its top. These were another popular form of mishvazen, like Humbaba. You can see a modern depiction of the lamassu in the logo of this show. Thank you to the artist Amanda Tank. You can commission her work at amandatank.com, which is based on an Assyrian work from around the time of Sargon II in the late 8th century BCE, except with my face on it. On top of that, the artwork for this specific episode is a modified version of Gilgamesh and Enkidu's battle against the Bull of Heaven, who is depicted with wings in the original piece. Ishtar led the bull toward Uruk, leaving a path of death in its wake. The fight began, but Enkidu and Gilgamesh were old pros at this time, and they quickly noticed the flashing red weak point on the hulking beast's neck. Devising a plan on the spot, Enkidu stepped on its tail and gave the signal to Gilgamesh to strike the flesh between the yoke and the butcher point. He thrust his sword into the soft spot and pulled it out, uncorking a fountain of blood. The bull of heaven died. They cut out its heart and offered it to Shamash, the sun god. Ishtar wept and mourned for the bull, but she wasn't done with these two arrogant destroyers of all things divine. While Gilgamesh taunted her, saying that he could have also killed her if she'd had the nerve to face him in person, she simply left, assured that she would see justice. The gods held a council to settle the matter. This is a common way of viewing the gods, and it's one present in the biblical texts. As mentioned last episode, Yahweh would have been on the second tier of this council originally, below only supreme gods like El and Asherah, before eventually being combined with El and retaining his wife for a time. In fact, in the latest creation story in the Bible, Genesis 1, God says, "Let us make man in our own image." This is broadly agreed to be a reference to the divine council. But in Psalm 82, the author has Yahweh condemn all of the other gods to mortality, citing their lack of just rule over the nations. Still, in other late texts, he retains his divine counsel, and in one such portrayal of the council in the book of Job, Yahweh, firmly seated as the top god, will conspire one day with a second-tier deity called the adversary, Ha-Satan, to make one man's life suck real bad. But that's all in the future. Let's get back to the story. Enkidu awakened from a nightmare and in a cold sweat. He dreamed of the divine council, and they were not happy. In the dream, they'd stated that the killing of Humbaba, the destruction of the forest, and the slaughter of the Bull of Heaven had not gone unnoticed. After a bit of bitchy back and forth between Enlil and Shamash, who accused each other correctly of sanctioning and providing aid in the killing of Humbaba, they settled on a solution to these young upstarts whose power threatened their own. One of them had to die, and it was Enkidu who was chosen. See, the gods were always afraid of humans somehow gaining divinity or immortality or wisdom or even too much power, which was something only they were supposed to have as gods, damn it. We see this in the story of the Garden of Eden, where after Adam and Eve consume the fruit of knowledge and wisdom, they become a threat to God's existence and so are removed from the garden, lest they, quote, reach out their hands and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever, end quote. And in the story of the Tower of Babel, the human achievement of a colossal pyramid represents a threat that they might reach up into the very heavens, the domain of the gods. In this story, too, Yahweh is portrayed as speaking to his council of the threat posed by the haughty humans, and this menace is put down by scattering humans across the world and giving them different languages, an etiology for why we don't all speak the same tongue. That was the point of the story. The divine council is merely a common motif based on their understanding of the world that helped communicate and bring meaning to it. Now, rarely is the person in these stories given forewarning of their impending doom for trotting on the god's toes, but Enkidu was blessed or perhaps cursed with this knowledge. He became depressed and then sick, cursing everyone who'd gotten him into this. The trapper, the prostitute Shamat, even the great cedar door he'd made that he thought would impress the gods so much and protect him from such a fate. The sun god Shamash convinced him to take back his curses, and he blessed Shamhat instead. After all, she was unaware of her part in all this, and it was she who had introduced him to his companion Gilgamesh in the first place. Shamash consoled Enkidu, assuring him that he would be remembered and mourned by everyone he'd ever met, and Enkidu's anger and sadness subsided, at least until he had another dream showing him just how unpleasant the afterlife was. The rest of the tablet is broken off here, so we don't know how tender Gilgamesh's last moments with Enkidu were, but given how the rest of the story goes, we can assume that they were every bit as devastating as you might imagine.
Enkidu fell to the ground, struck down by the gods, and Gilgamesh wept bitter tears, saying, "He who was my companion through adventure and hardship is gone forever."
After Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh stayed next to the body for 6 days and 7 nights, tellingly the same amount of time Enkidu and Shamhat had spent together, until a maggot fell out of the corpse's nose. Enkidu's body was then laid to rest, and funerary goods were entombed with him to appease the gods of the netherworld. Gilgamesh remained distraught and inconsolable. It's not only that his friend and probable lover was gone, but he also started realizing that, as someone who is half human, he too would one day die. Facing his mortality for the first time, he recalled the story of a man named Utanapishti, who according to legend had never died, and decided to track him down and learn his secret. Gilgamesh set off to find the end of the world, where Utanapishti was rumored to live, and immediately Shamash, the sun god, questioned just where in the hell Gilgamesh thought he was going, and didn't he know that this immortality quest was futile and he should cease all inquiries? But Gilgamesh pressed on. After a long journey, he made his way to the mountains that we all agree encircle the flat disk of our world, and he encountered the Scorpion Man who guards the border. You'll recall the Scorpion Man as one of the creatures Tiamat created in the Enuma Elish from our first episode, yet another mishphasin for your bestiary. Baffled that anyone made it this far, the Scorpion Man warned Gilgamesh that the journey through the mountain would be a full day in pitch black, where one could easily be lost and perish. The mountains were themselves the guiding rails for the rising and setting sun. Go into them, and Shamash would not be there to light the path. But Gilgamesh pressed on, walking for an entire day in the dark as he felt his way through the pitch black. When he emerged from the other side, he saw sights unimaginable. Sparkling lapis lazuli and other gems and precious stones growing on trees, a garden and forest unimaginable, yet another forest of the gods, this one perhaps more similar to Eden. This was where there was abundance. And perhaps some of that abundance trickled into our world. Perhaps this garden and forest were the source of all the sparkling and wonderful things we enjoy. Past these gardens lay the ocean shore, the bitter waters at the precipice of our world. For around 99.8% of human history, crossing the great expanses of the oceans was broadly thought to be a fool's errand. And to contemporary ancients listening to this story, the ocean with the waters of death in its midst would mark a hard border, an impenetrable barrier to Gilgamesh's quest. Who even knew what, if anything, laid on the other side? Likelier one would emerge to find the edge of the disk than something worthwhile. Better to stick with the known world. And this gives us a good opportunity to talk a bit more systematically about ancient cosmology, which was fairly standardized throughout the region for a long time. True, a few Greek philosophers were able to intuit in the first millennium BCE that the world was a sphere, but that was not a commonly accepted understanding and would struggle to gain full acceptance for a very long time. Far more universal is what we find in the Bible and in Gilgamesh, which is that the world exists on a flat disk, as I mentioned a bit ago. In the first episode, I talked about the Enuma Elish, where at the end Marduk splits the corpse of Tiamat, and its relationship to the similar motif in Genesis 1, where God separates the waters above from the deep below. So we have the earth disk at the center, waters below that seep up into the river sources, and waters above which leak down as rain through the holes in the firmament layer in the heavens. Somewhere in the heavens, it's often unclear exactly where, the gods were thought to live. And below our feet, in the earth, deep down below, was the underworld, Hebrew Sheol. At the edges of the world were the impenetrable mountains that Gilgamesh had passed through, and beyond that was the ocean, and presumably an edge one might fall off. And that's where we find our hero, at the threshold of this great danger. But Gilgamesh pressed on. Near the beach from a distance, the goddess spotted him, and disliking the cut of his jib, she barred her doors and went up on the roof. She was Shiduri, the tavern keeper of the alehouse at the end of the world. As the alewife, the madame of this bordello, she knew a rough customer when she saw one. Gilgamesh heard her bolting the gate shut and threatened to barge his way through them. Shiduri talked him down, asking to hear his story and just what he was doing so far outside the realm of mortals. He related his tale, how Enkidu, whom he loved, had returned to the clay, how he was inconsolable and could not leave his friend's side for a week after his death, and how he realized that one day death would come knocking for him too, but he would seek and find Utanipishti and discover the secret of immortality. In the old Babylonian version of the story, Shiduri, like Shamash, warns Gilgamesh to, well, get over it. And this could be in some ways connected not just to Enkidu's death, but the idea that, sure, you and your buddy had a little sex with each other, you're really close, like young men do, like young men are, but it's time to grow up. Something Dr. Ackerman points out in her book is that both Gilgamesh and Jonathan are portrayed as being in love with Enkidu and David respectively, and despite this love being compared to the love for a woman, they never are described as having that kind of love for any woman in their lives. They never mourn for women the way they do for their male companions. This is potentially part of the expectations for how a good king acts. Emotionless, putting aside this passionate love, adjudicating fairly and dispassionately. Having sex with the fellas or being in love, that's for the young and immature. However, in our version of the story, Shiduri warned Gilgamesh of the danger, but without trying to dissuade him too harshly from his voyage. She told him that there had been no crossing over the ocean for many, many years, and that only Utanapishti's boatman, or Shanabi, knew the way across, along with his stone ones. If anyone could ferry Gilgamesh across, it would be Ur-Shanabi. So Gilgamesh set off toward the dock. Just like Shiduri, Ur-Shanabi saw him from a distance and had the stone one seal him in his boat with his protective aura. Yet another person who saw the bad vibes coming off Gilgamesh from a mile away. They began to go out to sea, but Gilgamesh waded into the water and began smashing the stone ones with his axe, dumping them into the river. After this latest slaughter was completed, Ur-Shanabi was left alone, cowering with his own axe in his boat. But Gilgamesh reassured him that he would do him no harm. Asking Gilgamesh why the long face, the hero replied to the boatman with the same long, sorrowful tale he'd told so many times. Ur-Shanabi replied, "Your own hands, O Gilgamesh, have hindered your crossing. You smashed the stone ones, tipped them into the river." Indeed, the stone ones were not merely his guards, they were a key part in crossing the waters of death, and Gilgamesh had just sent them all to a watery grave. Ur-Shanabi instructed Gilgamesh to go cut down some pine trees and make 300 long punting poles. After he'd made enough to get them across the waters of death, they set off on their journey. Shoving the poles in the water one at a time, they made it about 30 miles or 50 kilometers from the shore when they finally ran out of poles. At that point, Gilgamesh took the boatman's shirt and held it up as a sort of makeshift sail, with Gilgamesh himself as the mast. Utanapishti spotted him from a distance, puzzled that the stone men were not with them. He greeted them at the wharf where they docked, and after pleasantries, Gilgamesh once again relayed his tale of love and loss and despair, mentioning that he hadn't slept for months, that he'd lived off animals he'd killed along the way, replacing his rotted clothes with animal pelts on his long journey from Uruk. In a way, he'd become this spitting image of Enkidu before he was civilized, matted hair, covered in fur, completely filthy. In yet another parallel to the book of Ecclesiastes, Utanapishti excoriated Gilgamesh for toiling away in futility, saying, "But you toiled away, and what did you achieve? You exhaust yourself with ceaseless toil. You fill your sinews with sorrow, bringing forward the end of your days. Vanity of vanities indeed." Still, Gilgamesh wanted to know just how Utanapishti had gained immortality so long ago. The elder man sighed and began his tale. Once upon a time there was a man named Utanapishti, who lived in the land of Shuruppak, some 30 miles or 50 kilometers north of Uruk. One day the god Ea, also known as Enki, told Utanapishti to build a huge boat. The shape and size of the boat changes depending on which society is telling the story. Originally, it's a big round kufa or coracle with differing amounts of decks inside. But as different styles of boat became more popular, it eventually took on its elongated shape that we're familiar with from the story of Noah. This shape became more popular in the first millennium BCE. Interestingly, there would be a much smaller tale of a hero being saved by stowing him in a sealed round basket and placed on the water. That's right, Sargon the Great, a real king who ruled sometime after the real Gilgamesh in Sumer. A later legend about him being stashed away in a tiny round boat would be written probably by Sargon II or one of his scribes, an Iron Age king of Neo-Assyria who needed to tie himself to the legendary past. So he commissioned a legendary and divine birth narrative about his spiritual successor Sargon I being saved from those who wanted to kill him by his priestess mother placing him in a basket sealed with bitumen and floating him down the water. A late tradition about Moses that is remarkably similar but set in Egypt would end up working its way into the book of Exodus, and this motif, seemingly a mini-me version of the flood and ark narrative, would make it as far as India, with the tale of the god Karna's birth having some of the same essential components, sometime a couple centuries after the Moses story was written probably. The specifics and contexts and names change, but the literary devices remain relatively stable. And speaking of names, in the case of the flood story protagonist, that also changes. In the original flood story, it's Ziusudra. In Genesis, it's Noah. In some early Akkadian sources, it's Atrahasis. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's usually Utnapishti or Utnapishtim, though sometimes Atrahasis is in there too. Sometimes he's a king, other times he's just a fairly well-off or good and faithful dude. Sometimes the gods decide to kill all humans because humans were immortal, and then there came to be too many of them, and their noise became a nuisance, keeping the gods awake at all hours of the night and day. In the biblical tale, it's because humans and animals won't be vegetarians like the primitive Enkidu, and like God had designed. And their violence becomes so overwhelming that, despite what some later biblical authors and most modern theologians say, God confesses that he regrets his act of creation, that he made a mistake and he's changed his mind. Only the flood hero Noah is found to be worthy of saving, along with his family. Everyone else is wiped away. In the epic's case, our flood hero is Utnapishtim. He wasn't given much reasoning for why the gods were intending to flood the earth, but he listened to Ea and built his 6-decked boat and covered it in bitumen pitch to waterproof it. He gathered animals of every kind and put them on board, along with all of his possessions and his family and friends, kith and kin. The gods sent multiple devastations into the land, killing many before finally the storm god Hadad unleashed the deluge for 6 days and 7 nights, killing everyone but Utnapishtim and those aboard the ark. The boat eventually ran aground on Mount Nimush, similar to the biblical tale's Mount Ararat, and just like Noah, Utnapishti sent out 3 birds in succession. In the version we're using, it's a dove, a swallow, and a raven. The dove returned, the swallow returned, but the raven did not, indicating that finally there was enough dry land and life had returned. This bird section may be an etiology for why doves and swallows live near humans, but ravens kept a distance. Like Noah, Utnapishtim made a sacrifice after disembarking from the boat, and the smell attracted the gods, who quote-unquote ate the sacrifices made in shrines and temples. Enlil was enraged when he found out Ea had spared a human from his terror, but Ea retorted that there was no need to wipe out all of humanity for the transgressions of a few of them. Why not limit their lives and merely send a plague or famine or wolf or any other natural disaster to punish the society? And there, again, we see an etiology, this time for natural disasters and predators. Interestingly, the Noah story also has a couple of etiologies. The most famous is that Yahweh hangs up his war bow in the sky as a rainbow, as his promise to never unleash his storm god powers so thoroughly again. But the second etiology is one that seems to preserve an older tradition where Noah's primary story was as the first agriculturalist. But just like the flood story was inserted into the Gilgamesh epic, Noah himself was later given the role of the hero of the deluge. We'll cover all of Noah's lore in a later episode. Utnapishtim's story concluded with Enlil agreeing that he would no longer attempt to kill all humans, like Yahweh, and pleased by the sacrifice, he granted Utnapishtim and his family eternal life and gave them the land beyond the waters of death. And you too, it is implied, would live a longer life if, just like caring for the dead in the last episode, you cared for the gods. Important point. Gilgamesh was crushed. There was no way to replicate this exact series of events. But Utnapishtim told him that there might be another way for him to gain immortality. All he had to do was stay up for 6 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh squatted down, readying himself to stay awake for this duration and gain the immortality he so craved. He was locked in. He had all of his favorite energy drinks around. He was ready. He immediately fell asleep. 7 nights later, as Utnapishtim's wife baked for him his daily bread, Gilgamesh awoke. Utnapishtim, like the sex worker from the earliest parts of the Enkidu story, had Gilgamesh hosed down and cleaned up, clothed in royal garb, and he sent him on his way, telling the ferrymen to never come back. And we start to see part of the moral of the story emerge. Gilgamesh's life had been fun but wild and destructive, and now it was time for him to become a civilized man. And they even wash and clothe him like when Enkidu was first civilized. Before they pushed off in the boat, however, Utnapishtim pulled Gilgamesh in close and told him a secret of the gods. At the bottom of the ocean, there was a plant, and whoever could pick and eat the plant would regain their youth. That's right, there's one last shot at some kind of immortality. So they took the boat back out to the ocean, and after precisely following Utnapishtim's instructions, Gilgamesh attached stones to his ankles and sank to the bottom. He searched around for a bit until he'd found it, the plant that granted rejuvenation. He cut the stones loose and returned to the boat, plant in hand, telling Ur-Shanabi, the boatman, that he would bring the plant back to Uruk and replant it, and then eat some. They began the overland track back to Uruk, and along the way they stopped to drink from a cold pool of water. A snake smelled the plant, and while Gilgamesh was distracted, it took the plant in its mouth and slithered away, shedding its skin as it disappeared into the grass. Etiology number 5, is it? 6, 7? Snakes regenerate their youth and hence shed their old skin because they stole the rejuvenating plant from Gilgamesh. In the Garden of Eden story, which is obviously similar, the snake talks Eve into eating the fruit God told her not to, and so God curses the snake to always be hated by humans and to be forced to slither on its belly. While much later Christian readings, formulated after the New Testament was written, would ignore this explanation in favor of equating the snake with Satan, these two were originally etiologies for why snakes don't have legs and for why humans hate them. That's part of the point of these stories. They're entertaining, but they also fill in gaps of knowledge, because something like the scientific method wouldn't emerge to explain for thousands of years afterwards why snakes are the way they are. But let us continue our saga. Then Gilgamesh sat there weeping. Down his cheeks the tears were coursing. He spoke to Ur-Shanabi the boatman. For whom, Ur-Shanabi, toiled my arms so hard? For whom ran dry the blood of my heart? Not for myself did I find a bounty. For the lion of the earth I have done a favor. Now far and wide the tide is rising. Having opened the channel, I abandoned the tools. What thing would I find that served as my landmark? Had I only turned back and left the boat on the shore? At 20 leagues they broke bread. At 30 leagues they pitched camp. When they arrived in Uruk the sheepfold, said Gilgamesh to him, to Ur-Shanabi the boatman, O Ur-Shanabi, climb Uruk's wall, and walk back and forth. Survey its foundations, examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundations? A square mile is city, a square mile date grove, a square mile is clay pit. Half a square mile, the temple of Ishtar. 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse. Gilgamesh wiped away his tears and returned home, proud of his city, beaming at its divine heritage as he gave the ferryman a tour. The end.
Pretty good story, don't you think? Made me laugh to beat the band. Parts, anyway. I didn't like seeing
Enkidu
go.
But you say, that's kind of anticlimactic. What do you mean he just goes back, admires his city with Ur-Shanabi the boatman, and that's it? Nothing's resolved. There's still a bunch of time left in the episode. What the hell's going on? Well, isn't that how life really goes sometimes? By demanding a quote-unquote satisfying ending, aren't we missing the point of the story, which is to grow up and put aside childish dreams and to come to terms with our own mortality? Go read Ecclesiastes, where it concludes that such striving is meaningless. This is already over 10,000 words, and I haven't even incorporated the interview segments. Adding more would merely undercut the entire message. We can all make our own satisfying endings. The rest of the story is yours to write. No? Fine. You people are so goddamn ungrateful. Lucky for you, there were apparently a few folks in antiquity of poor taste who agreed that the ending needed some more oomph. So without further ado, here's the secret ending to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Tablet 12, In Those Days, in Those Far-Off Days, also known as Gilgamesh and the Netherworld. I will admit that I don't think it's necessary for the epic, nor is it really a great ending, but the story is pretty fun, so here we go. In those days, in those far-off days, in those nights, in those distant nights, in those years, in those far-off years, in olden times, after the primeval things had become manifest. In those days there was a willow tree. At the beginning of the world, as the god Ea, also known as Enki, was traveling down to the underworld, his boat kicked up a nasty wake, and the storm blew over the willow tree. While jogging one day, the goddess Inanna saw the fallen tree, paused the episode of Pod Safe Sumer she was listening to, picked it up, and brought it home, intending to make furniture out of it eventually. Many years later, it was infected by a blight of evil spirits. After finding no help among the gods, Inanna enlisted Gilgamesh, who quickly expelled the demons. She crafted her furniture and then gave the leftover wood to Gilgamesh, and he made a stick and ball out of it for a classic game of stickball. Gilgamesh, as a good king, participated in civic events like the playing of ball and stick with the lads and men of Uruk. But after the first day of sport, the fellas had been playing Mesopotamian cricket so long that their ladies, relegated to the role of water and food fetchers during the match, asked the gods to intervene. As the game was about to restart the next morning, the stick and ball dropped into a hole that suddenly appeared, and they were sucked into the netherworld. Gilgamesh stuck his arm into the hole, but he couldn't get them back out. We pan over to reveal that Enkidu is still alive. That's right, this is set earlier in the story, despite sometimes being affixed as an ending. Anyway, Gilgamesh started crying, as he often does in these stories, and he was absolutely distraught. My ball has fallen down to the netherworld. Who will bring it up for me? My mallet has fallen down to Ganzir. Who will bring it up for me? The underworld was usually thought to be really deep underground, and some early cave drawings and writings have been found far, far into caves and tunnels, where one could hardly see, apparently trying to reach down and honor those who'd passed below. Enkidu volunteered to go into the netherworld and retrieve their lost sporting implements. If that sounds like a slightly contrived setup for some crummy DLC or a straight-to-video Leprechaun sequel, you're right. I warned you. I fucking told you. But it's also basically the plot to The Sandlot, so that's neat. Anyway, Gilgamesh instructed Enkidu that in order to survive a trip into the dusty, dark, and cold netherworld, he had to be extremely careful, polite, and most importantly, discreet. The shades down there were easily disturbed and would latch on to anything that seemed foreign. This is a stealth mission. Don't throw sticks. Don't wear bright, clean clothes. Don't put in hair product. Don't make any noises. And most importantly, don't seek out your dead loved ones. Don't kiss the ones you loved or beat the ones you hated. Don't do it. Be discreet. Enkidu put on his brightest garb and his stinkiest pomade and dove into death's hole. He started throwing stuff, he made a big ruckus, and he sought out his loved ones, kissing the wife and son he loved and striking the ones he hated. Immediately the shades grabbed him and dragged him deeper. Gilgamesh, somehow seeing this all from above, became distraught. Enkidu had died in a horrible way, not in battle and not even on Earth. Gilgamesh went to the gods, begging them to help him. Finding no aid from Enlil or some of the other big names, he went to Ea, aka Enki, who agreed to help him out, and Shamash tagged along. The sun god cracked open a hole in the underworld and brought Enkidu's shade up. By this point, apparently, Enkidu's body and breath had left him a mere shade. No matter, though, as the gods pulled off the underworld heist and restored Enkidu to life. The reunited wild man and king hugged and kissed each other, and Gilgamesh asked his friend what he'd seen down below. Here's Gilgamesh. Did you see the way things are ordered in the netherworld? If only you could tell me, my friend, if only you could tell me. Enkidu. If I am to tell you the way things are ordered in the netherworld, oh, you sit down and weep. Gilgamesh. Then let me sit down and weep. Enkidu delivered the horrible news. Your heart rejoiced to handle the penis, but the penis is like an old beam, infested with grubs. It said, when can I go to the vagina? But the vagina is like a crack in the ground, filled with dust. Ah, woe, cried the Lord, and sat down in the dust. That's right, your dick don't work in the afterlife, and pussies are like cracks in the ground. That's the first thing Enkidu said about how bad it was. Not lying here, it's in the story. Bafflingly, Gilgamesh begged to hear more. Last episode, you heard Kerry, Sonia discussing offering sacrifices and water and libations of wine to the dead, and that's exactly what Enkidu related to Gilgamesh. He told him that he saw the man who'd had one son in life to care for him, and he was miserable. He saw the man who'd had 2 sons, and he got to sit on 2 bricks and eat bread. Not bad. He saw the man with 3 sons, and he got to drink water. Now we're talking. He numbered them as increasingly fortunate, up to 7 sons, and that man was second only to the gods above. Men with no heirs ate bread as hard as bricks. Women who'd borne no children were tossed aside and forgotten. Men who died falling off roofs, their bones remained broken. Men who died as lepers, they were still outcasts. Men who lied when swearing some truth in their god's name were drinking salt water in Jepson's Malort. Stillborn babies got to play in a near paradise. Those who died honorable deaths had a good afterlife. Those who died in fire, a fear in the Middle East from ancient times even to today, they simply evaporated into smoke. You get the picture. It reflected the common cultural beliefs and social realities around death, of bad spirits and how one might acquire them by accident, of reassurances to grieving families, and of what constitutes good behavior in one's life here on Earth. Again, it's not always about the dead, it's also about the living. It's also about us. Did you see the one whose shade has no one to make funerary offerings? I saw him. He eats scrapings from the pot and crusts of bread thrown away in the street. The end. It's basically the same as the Pixar movie Coco, but with more maggot dicks and dirt pussies. So this tablet was sometimes appended to the end of the epic to add some kind of finality and rumination on death, a moral lesson for folks who really needed something a bit more explicit. This focus on the underworld also fits with another tablet which, while apparently not part of the epic in any of the copies I've seen detailed, related a different legend about Gilgamesh dying and becoming the lord of the underworld. Now that's the kind of consolation prize a writer today would affix onto the end of a story to make it more satisfying. These sorts of parallel traditions can sometimes come back around, perhaps starting as oral traditions and ending up as part of someone's later text, even if they avoid or contradict more official or popular versions. Gilgamesh doesn't actually become Lord of the Netherworld in Tablet 12 that I recounted above, and yet that tradition seems to have influenced a tablet that was sometimes part of the epic. This kind of complex legacy eventually happens with several traditions around Moses. See, in the Torah, Moses dies, and while his burial place is said to have been secret, he definitely dies. But legendary stories of him being taken up and never dying, like Elijah or Enoch, were developed alongside this official literary tradition, and they end up with him being described in the Gospels as appearing suddenly during the Transfiguration, something he shouldn't be able to do as a guy who clearly died. They didn't believe the resurrection had happened yet, and so if Moses died, he should by all rights not be there. But there was a great diversity of belief in Roman and Greek-era Judaism, and the Hebrew Bible canon wasn't fully settled. And so you end up with a story based on traditions that would not make their way into the Christian canons, which contradict the history that fundamentalists draw from the Moses story, but it's right there in the 3 of the Gospels. Similarly, in one story in the Exodus, Moses faces down against magicians who aren't named, but oral traditions led to the names Jannes and Jambres being given to them, which in turn ended up being written into the non-canonical Apocryphon of Jannes and Jambres, and the epistle, 2 Timothy, which is canonical in virtually all Christian traditions. And that brings us to the reasons I wanted to give the Epic of Gilgamesh its own episode. First, it's a great story. Second, and maybe most obviously, it has lore that directly and indirectly influenced the Bible, with it being quoted verbatim in Ecclesiastes. But third, it also gives us a good window into how this kind of literary composition could function. Stories could be weaved together into longer narratives. Names could be changed, real people given godlike status. Edits and redactions were done to fix perceived problems. Parts were left out that might seem logical to us to keep in. And so these leftover vestiges of now shunned or lost material would wind up as what scholars call blind motifs. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s, and among them were found fragments and occasionally large amounts of every book of the Bible except Esther, along with a wide variety of other material. The copies are from between the 200s BCE through to the 1st century CE, somewhere around a 300-year period. We'll cover the scrolls in detail way down the line, but they show us that even at a pretty late date, this kind of editing and redaction and parallel traditions that we see among Gilgamesh was still alive and well in the text that would later become the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. We can see the process occurring in these scrolls. Among the scrolls, for example, archaeologists found fragments of the Book of Giants, a late 1st millennium, say 3rd century BCE, cousin of the apocalyptic Jewish book 1st Enoch. In this yarn, set before the global flood, as an explanation and justification for the deluge, Gilgamesh and Humbaba have brief pre-flood cameos as some of the antediluvian giants. But by this point, the epic had fallen out of fashion, and Gilgamesh was reduced to mostly a name, the kind of stock character who, despite once seeking out the ancient flood hero himself, could be shunted haphazardly before the sky starts falling. Gilgamesh and his friends had by that point mostly disappeared into the dirt. See, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire that had destroyed the kingdom of Israel fell to a combined force of Neo-Babylonians and Persian Medes in 612 BCE, the cuneiform writing that was so central to the Bronze Age likewise started to falter, and much of its literature faded with it. The alphabet that had briefly become popular at Ugarit before the Bronze Age collapse had evolved and become popular again. The Neo-Babylonians would only last a century as the imperial hegemon themselves. In that time, they destroyed the kingdom of Judah as well, and took some of its elites as captives in what we now call the Babylonian exile. But 100 years after Babylon overthrew Assyria, the Persian Achaemenid Empire would in turn crush the Babylonians, establishing Aramaic as the official imperial language, and alphabets spread throughout the region. The Achaemenids would themselves be defeated a couple centuries later by Alexander the Great, giving rise to his fractured successors, and then the Roman Republic and Empire a few centuries later, and within a century or so of Augustus Caesar at the turn of the eras, cuneiform would go completely extinct, with no one able to read it again until the 1800s. As it stands, the Epic of Gilgamesh acts as a great bookend for both the beginning and the end of this pre-Persian period, which likewise started to give rise to the idea of quote-unquote real history, as exemplified by early Greek historians like Herodotus and Thucydides. While the gods would continue to interact in these historical writings, and purely mythological writings also continued, these histories purported to tell events as they really happened, speaking with eyewitnesses and recounting their tales, something of less importance to scribes of our earlier period. In this way, the Iron Age can often act as a sort of transitional period, a long one, but over these next few episodes, we're going to examine this period in its own right. We're going to examine the Iron Age. These people maybe hoped, but didn't know, that they were developing and sometimes overturning ideas from the Bronze Age, which would continue to be so influential beyond their own time. So there we have it, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Global floods, ideologies for how things got to be the way they are, relationships between men with ambiguous eroticism, the garden and the mountain of the gods, hybrid mishvahs, and so much more. While Gilgamesh as a written epic was almost entirely lost after the Neo-Assyrian Empire's destruction, folklore and legends, influenced both directly and indirectly by these same tales, whether in written or oral tradition, would be one stream in the social circumstances that gave us the Hebrew Bible as we have it today. And it's to this murky post-collapse history that we'll turn to next time on the Bible Lore Podcast. Is there any of your work that you'd like to plug, or anything that you've got coming up that you'd like to advertise here?
Well, I do have a book I'm just finishing right now that as you were, in answer to your last question, this book is very much a part of the, especially looking at extra biblical materials. So the book is on women's life cycle rituals in ancient Israel, and it goes from the birth of a girl child through a young woman's coming of age, through betrothal, through marriage, through pregnancy, motherhood, and then death. Unfortunately, it ends on a kind of downer note.
It usually does.
But so, for example, I've been very, very interested in thinking about ritual actions that are a part of pregnancy and childbirth, and we can barely say what those might be from the Bible. We can maybe say from Genesis 25 that a woman who's experiencing trouble during her pregnancy, as Rebecca was when she felt this struggle in her womb, would go to a sacred place and try and seek an oracle explaining what's happening to her, right? That's I can maybe say that, but
because of the focus oftentimes on more of the temple purity stuff, we're not always privy to kind of the oracles, the magic, the whatever you want to call it, that they sought out, which is unfortunately.
But we're much more privy to that in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Hittite world, in the Canaanite world, in the Greek world. We're much, much more privy to that. And so I've been very interested in the degree to which those traditions can be read in parallel with the biblical tradition to suggest, hey, what is just kind of touched on in this biblical text or alluded to in this biblical text is actually a much more widespread tradition within the ancient world, and we could use that to suggest it was widespread in ancient Israel as well, although again, not something the biblical writers are particularly prone to tell us.
And when do you anticipate that to be released?
Well, I'm just finishing it, and anyone who has written a scholarly book will tell you it takes ridiculously long to move from finished to publish. It's a year-long process. I never understand why it takes that long. So it'll be out next fall. So when you and I talk next August, we can talk about that.
Thanks again to the wonderful Susan Ackerman. You can find our full interview at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. It's just $5 a month, but it goes a long way. And thanks to all of you for sharing the show around. I've been wanting to rant into a microphone about the Epic of Gilgamesh for like a year now, and I'm glad there are folks who enjoy my descent into madness. I've gotten overwhelmingly positive feedback, so I'm going to keep putting out episodes and keep doing the show. Make sure to tell your friends about the show and leave nice comments and reviews wherever possible. See you next time.